So, welcome to this podcast. My name's David Curtis, and I'm delighted, I'm really excited for this conversation between Sophus Helle and Celene Lillie. And in bringing these two together, I'm bringing the worlds of Thunder Perfect Mind and Inana together. So, Sophus Helle is a leading expert on the whole world of Inanna. He's a writer, translator, and cultural historian with a special interest in Babylonian epics. Um, and he's the author of the Complete Poems of Enheduana, and a translator of Gilgamesh. And he describes himself as having a passion for taking seemingly obscure topics and making them relevant. Uh, and to include love in Disney and other sort of modern music sort of as part of his writing as well. And Celine's also a writer, a translator, scholar of early Christianity, um, currently working at the University of Colorado Boulder, and where one of her students says that she is one of the most amazing human beings that she's ever met, that she cares deeply and is passionate, and that they would definitely recommend taking a class of hers simply because her presence brings joy and light into the room. But that is balanced. I must admit, that is balanced by another student who complains about the amount of reading that she gives out. So, not universally popular, but some people really like it. So, welcome both. And as I say, bringing together these two is bringing together the world of Thunder Perfect Mind with the world of Inanna. Maybe I could ask you each in turn to sort of say a little bit about what each of these are. Celene, perhaps you'd like to start by just giving a brief introduction to Thunder Perfect Mind. What is it? When was it written, etc. Thank you.
So, the Thunder Perfect Mind is, I'm kind of obsessed with this text. I've been working on it for a very long time and was introduced to it when I was actually 19 years old. I love this text. Um, but it was one of the texts that was found in the discovery at Nag Hammadi, which there are some controversies right now around provenance, whether this was found as part of the Pacomian monastery there, or if these were actually texts that were buried with folks. So a big scholarly debate around this. But our best guess is that it was written sometime between the first century BCE and the first century CE, at least the core part of it. And it is a female deity, the voice of a female deity speaking in an eye, who embodies all of these opposites and thirds and kind of goes on for pages and pages and pages and pages and pages, saying things like she's the first and the last and the silence never found, and ideas infinitely recalled. And interestingly, I think just this text in the last 30, 40 years has been really um, taken up more by the public than it has by scholars. There's an epitaph using it at the beginning of Toni Morrison's Jazz, the novel Jazz. There are music compositions that have been written to it, and all kinds of both literary and poetic kind of uses of the text. But it's fascinating, and I think we're still trying to figure out the right questions to ask about it.
Celine. And then, Sophus, perhaps you'd like to similarly introduce Inanna and particularly the works of Enheduana.
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for curating this discussion and bringing these texts together, David. Because I think already from these opening remarks, I think it's going to be very clear how much of these texts share. I think the works of Enheduanna also for a long time have been sort of mainly living in with the public and with various adaptations and sort of been understudied in scholarship. And it also has this like strange paradoxical power. But yeah, so Enheduanna is the first author whose name is known. So she is the first historical individual to whom a work of literature was attributed. She was a royal princess and high priestess who lived in the 23rd century BCE. So her father created the first known empire, the Old Akkadian Empire, and then made her high priestess in the city of Ur, where she served as high priestess for the moon god Nanna. And she is best known for these two poems that she wrote, hymns actually to a different deity, the goddess Inanna, who was a sort of, goddess of her father's empire. But these are really extraordinary works of literature, in part because Inanna herself is such an interesting character. She is the goddess of change, of contradiction, of paradoxes, of opposites, goddess of sex, goddess of war, really goddess of things that change the world in a sense. And she is, I think, one of the most fascinating figures of the ancient Near East, but also arguably one of the most fascinating deities of the ancient world. And we'll explore her more over the course of this conversation, I'm sure. But just to briefly introduce these two texts that Enheduana writes to her, these are two hymns. They are called the Exaltation of Inanna and the Hymn to Inanna. And both of them combine these quite remarkable celebration of Inanna and her powers of paradox with an autobiographical section. However, in the Hymn to Inanna, that autobiographical section has sadly been lost. But those are the two main poems we're talking about. I should also briefly say these poems are both written in the Sumerian language, and Sumerian is written with the cuneiform script, which is the oldest script that we know of. So when writing was invented, it was cuneiform that was invented. And one last thing, there's a lot to sort of just to set the scene here. One last thing that needs to be mentioned is that Inanna was also known by another name, Ishtar. And that is because this cuneiform writing, it was used to write the Sumerian language, but it was also used to write the Akkadian language. And in Akkadian, Inanna is known as Ishtar. And by the time Enheduana is writing, these two figures have fully merged. So I might occasionally say Ishtar, but bear in mind that that's the same character as Inanna. So that's sort of the setup.
Yeah, thanks, Sophus. And so there's two poems written by Enheduana, and if we then turn to sort of what sort of literature we might think of thunder as, is that in the world of poetry or a hymn, or what could we say about thunder as what sort of form of, is it a hymn? What is thunder? In,
I mean, I think probably the closest thing we could call it to is a hymn that it is. Um, Except the interesting thing, and we so when we talk about genre in terms of Thunder Perfect Mind, one of the things we talk about is erotology. And so this is this form of kind of self-revelatory, we might call them hymns, but they're written in praise of oneself rather than in praise of someone else. And so we get these in the ancient world around figures like the goddess Isis from Egypt or Osiris. We find kind of pieces of these in places like Proverbs in the Hebrew Bible, where Sophia kind of speaks in this I in an exalted way. One of the things that scholars find very interesting about thunder that is not like a lot of these kind of more self-revelatory um, praise hymns is that she embodies both exalted and lowly places, that um, she's not simply speaking kind of in praise of her worldly powers. What I'm pausing around is I was going to say in praise of herself, but I do wonder if there is this idea that part of her power actually lies in her ability to um, inhabit um, even more spaces than kind of these typical exalted deities.
Yeah, sorry, I think so much of this conversation will go with us saying, "Oh, that's that's also like Inanna," and I think, but really, part of what is so remarkable about Inanna as a goddess is that she is associated with two as levels of society, to put it crudely, the highest and the lowest. She is in a way the goddess of kings, in part because she has this tremendous power inside her, including the powers of transformation. But she is also associated with the outcasts, with sex workers and those at the very sort of outskirts of society. And I think that's so interesting as well that you will see both depictions of her as royal splendor and the very limits of the respectable.
Which, of course, we get paralleled in Thunder with "I am the whore and the holy woman." There's that sort of direct parallel there of both the highest and the lowest sort of positions. Um, and then perhaps to bring out something of this paradox and seeming contradiction that exists within each text. Perhaps you'd both like to speak to that. Celene, would you like to speak something about the how the paradox is in Thunder? And
I mean, it's interesting, and I'm actually gonna pull the text a minute because I feel like it's helpful to see the way in which this works a little bit. But you bring up this very beginning piece where I am the first and the last, I'm the honored and the scorned, I am the whore and the holy woman, and then I am the wife and the virgin, which aren't they're kind of opposites but not quite so opposite. I'm the mother and the daughter. I'm the limbs of my mother. I'm a sterile woman who has many children. And so we get this very it's very paradoxical, and it's not just opposites. It's almost impossibilities that this voice holds within itself. Relationships that would seem impossible, and yet she embodies them all.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I think one of the things that I pick up on in that passage is both the sort of the power of the paradox to describe this being that is with beyond words, beyond our usual categories, and so on and so forth, but also the format of the list, which also recurs in
Yeah.
Enheduana, that I think the list can become a way of beginning to express the inexpressible. And we can talk about in a moment why that would be, but I don't immediately have an answer for that. But let me also just then read a passage from a list in the hymn, which is sort of this is the central section in the hymn, which I think really gets us as a characterization of Inanna. But just to read a bit from the beginning, to run, to flee, to calm and to quiet are yours, Inanna. To roam, to rush, to rival, to rise, and to throw down are yours, Inanna. To set out on path or road, to rest at a place of peace, to help a tired friend are yours, Inanna. To maintain the tracks and trails, to split the earth and make it firm are yours, Inanna. To destroy and to create, to plant and to pluck out are yours, Inanna. To turn men into women, to turn women into men are yours, Inanna. And then it goes on for a while. It's a very long passage with all of these, contradictions. I think, it's an interesting combination, both the sort of the contradictory and the sort of the slippery nature of the contradictions, as you pointed out, Celine, the way it's not just dichotomies, but dichotomies that keep shifting. But also, again, yeah, this format of the list.
it sort of makes both of these goddesses sort of ungraspable. Like there's a sort of unknowable quality to both of them. And I'm curious about the effect that it has on the reader to um, the experience of these lists for me personally is it kind of confounds the intellectual part of my mind, and then that part can shut down so another part of awareness can sort of open up in response to my lack of ability to grasp what is this then, what is thunder, what is Inara. How does that land with either of you?
Yeah, no, I think that that's definitely interesting, and I think part of Inanna's power that I think is evoked by these Enheduana poems more, I think, powerfully than in any other of the poems about Inanna, or at least of the ones that I know, is that she really is beyond comprehension, and like Enheduana returns to this theme again and again, and I think. She says at one point, even An does not understand her ways, and An was the grandfather of all the gods, one of the great moral authorities among the gods, so he doesn't understand her. And I think it is, this daring poetic project that she sets out on to describe the indescribable, and it has to be this poem that is constantly, pushing beyond itself and sort of unraveling itself as it goes along. And one of the ways that it does so is that it, makes these leaps. It just goes straight from one metaphor to a completely different kind of image, and the reader is sort of like left trying to catch up, but always falling a bit behind this poem. And often the engine that is carrying us from one image to the other, or the bridge, depending on which metaphor you want to go for, is associations at the level of sound, right? So like the ear is sort of pulled along while the mind is like running to catch after. And I think that's part of the effect of this poem.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and this is making me want to go back and look at the Coptic. One of my colleagues spent a lot of time kind of looking at the theories of thunder. Is that it was kind of originally written in Greek and then translated into Coptic. But one of my colleagues, Jada Calloway, really noticed the ways in which the poem has been what she calls thoroughly Copticized. Like the way it sounds in Coptic, I mean, you can just hear the poetics. And so just even you speaking, Sophus, makes me want to go back and kind of look at this kind of again and again and again. One of the things in particular that we kind of ask about thunder, and I love what you're pointing out about the hymn and the exaltation and the excess that's there, and kind of the reader can never quite catch up. Um, and there's something that is very clearly resonant with that in thunder. But one of the other questions that we ask about thunder is around this I, and that if this was a performance piece and if people are reading it, anytime we're speaking an I, there becomes an identification with the speaker who's actually speaking in the moment and the speaker in the text. And so, what does it do also to collapse these ideas that one has about their human self if they are like, we can never actually catch up with ourselves too? And of course, thinking about more contemporary psychological theories, but thinking about like Freud and the unconscious or Jung, which I also found very interesting in your work, Sophus, that it was a Jungian analyst who really picked up um, the exaltation, and I think it was the exaltation that she wrote about. And Jungians are very much more interested in thunder than historians for the most part, partially because I think of what is the effect on the self when you are engaging um, with the unruly paradox and contradiction and the fast kind of clips that you notice as you read these lists that just keep cascading like a waterfall. And I mean, I think this is one of the big questions about both of these texts is like, what do they do to the reader? Um, what spaces are opened up by the way the text is structured in and of itself?
Yeah, and I think this whole question of voice is so interesting. And I think in Enheduana you get a somewhat different play, but still a sort of an interesting relation between these two things, because there you have a named speaker, and that's of course what helps us to put these poems on the literary map, as it were, that speaker is then a person we can identify in the historical record. So this Enheduana person, and she is the narrator of these poems, and then there's this very remarkable moment in the exaltation, a moment that I've spent so many years thinking about and working on and writing on, in which, she becomes an author. And again, because she is the first known author, it's really significant. And she describes how she, gives birth to this text and this sort of intimate communion with Inanna. And we don't need to go into the whole background of the plot there, but she's sort of like saving herself out of exile by recruiting Inanna to help her and overcoming her own crisis of confidence, her own crisis of eloquence by composing this poem that we are reading, So sort of like the poem depicts itself coming into being. And then Enheduana gives these words that she has composed in this sort of intimate communion with Inanna to a singer, a kind of singer called a gala, who we might return to later. But this gala singer then repeats these words the following day. And in the line after, this Galasinger is mentioned, Enheduana then becomes a third person character, having been a first person narrator up to that point, right? So she gives the poem to somebody else and sort of steps out of it almost, you know? And then they're in this short epilogue, both her and Inanna are in the third person. And it can be then quite hard to tell which of them exactly is meant at any one time. And there are, I think, some lines there in that passage that are quite deliberately ambiguous and can be read both one way and another. So yeah, like that's sort of also, that really gets us to that collapse of identities between the person praying and the goddess being prayed to.
So I was thinking about sort of the differences between the two texts, and I was thinking, Thunder very much sort of takes place the part of the exiled and the outcast and the barbarian and the lowest in society, and to what extent does Enheduana's writing does that? Of course, in herself, she is the exiled one within that poem. Whilst Inanna might be too powerful and mighty to take the exiled position, um, Enheduanna herself in the poem is the exiled. So there is this interest also with the exiles.
Do you want to go first, Celine?
No.
Okay. So I mean, I
Yeah,
think
please. Yeah, address the question. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think the question with exile is so interesting because it really gets us at here the contradictions not so much of Inanna but of Enheduanna herself. And I think, we really have to be careful here because I think on the one hand there is this I mean, people call it a temptation, which might be the wrong word, but like, we want to read Enheduanna as an almost liberatory figure because, because she's a woman and because she's sort of been silenced and so on and so forth. But at the same time, she was the daughter of an emperor, and she is here, singing about wanting to rain death on the rebels. You know what I mean? That is what this text is also about. And yes, she is driven into exile by somebody who takes power in the city of Ur, but that person taking power in the city is rebelling against this, against this empire. So I think our political allegiances can be sort of a bit mixed in the case of Enheduanna, which is what makes her interesting. That doesn't make her less interesting. That makes her more interesting. That's I think if anything why she belongs in the canon. Like there are so many of these figures in the canon that are ambivalent in that particular way. Think of Ovid, think of Virgil. It's precisely the ones that both can speak the language of power and be critical of power in various ways at the same time that I think fascinate us most. And I think, yeah, so her exile and her return to exile is very much a part of that. I'm just gonna say one more thing. She says at one point that she has entered the Nipar, which is this temple in which the high priestess lived. And I think it's very like the verb in Sumerian is very, very intensely marked for her agency. I have entered this, which in historical terms is sort of questionable because it was her father who had put her there. But her father is entirely erased from the picture. He doesn't figure anywhere in the poem. And this rebellion is sort of portrayed as if it were against her, not against the empire, and is put down by her words, not by the armies of the empire. You know what I mean? So she sort of scrubs all the men from the picture to depict this sort of this historical situation as very much sort of an internal struggle and a struggle of her and her relation to the goddess, which is again, I think, one of the ways in which one can then read it in this proto-feminist way. And so, there are sort of different different ways of looking at it that are available.
Yeah, I so appreciate, one of the interesting things about Thunder is that we have no social context for it. We really don't know anything we don't know anything about the poem. This is the only copy we have. We have one copy with kind of um, no one else, none of the other kind of early church folks talked about it. And so there's something to me about like listening to you speak about Enheduanna that's so enticing because there is this context around it. And I notice the way that historians kind of think about thunder is they want to pin it down. They want it to either be the voice of Sophia or the voice of Eve or the voice of Barbelo, instead of kind of leaning in to um, to this vast proliferation. But just like kind of going back to this question about like thinking about power and position, one of the things that I also find very interesting about thunder is that um, people constantly ask, like, what's this voice's relationship to empire? And again, I'm just going to read this little piece because I think it shows this contradiction and the not wanting to kind of um, maybe to want to claim all spaces instead of just one, but where she says, why then did you hate me, you Greeks? Because I am a barbarian among barbarians? I am the wisdom of the Greeks and the knowledge of the barbarians. I am the deliberation of both the Greeks and barbarians, and I am he whose image is multiple in Egypt. I am she who is without an image among the barbarians. I am she who is hated in every place, and she who was loved in every place. I am she whom they call life, and you all call the death. I am she whom they call law, and you all called lawlessness. I am she whom you chased, and she whom you captured. I am she whom you scattered, and you have gathered me together. I am she before whom you were ashamed, and you have been shameless to me. I am she who does not celebrate festivals, and I am she whose festivals are spectacular.
That's really beautiful.
One thing that we notice in that is that that's mostly a list of she's, but sometimes it's a he that's speaking there. So there's this sort of confusion of gender roles that we're getting within Thunder. Um, Sophus, would you like to say something about sort of in Inanna, um, gender, mixing up of gender roles? Is that
Yeah.
paralleled at all in the world of Inanna and Enheduana?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about the way in which this text is trying to express the inexpressible nature of Inanna and the way that she is beyond words and beyond categories. And definitely one of the aspects of Inanna is that she is beyond gender. That doesn't mean that she herself is not female. Like she's quite like, as it were, emphatically female, especially in some of the sort of erotic descriptions of her. But I think she has the power to transform people's gender and especially this group of worshippers. And there are multiple different categories that seem to correspond to different kinds of gender categories or gendered roles within the worship of Inanna. And in the hymn to Inanna, Enheduana describes the creation of multiple such categories, including the Pili Pili, which is a wonderful name, and the Kurungara. And there are several others as well. I actually have one of these gender bending, what I don't know fully know what the right word for it, what the right modern term for it, whether we can call them queer or whatever. One scholar in another context uses the term extraordinary gender, which I think is really appropriate for them. But I actually have one of these extraordinary genders tattooed on my arm, which sort of tells you my interest in them. But yeah, they would do things like dress up as men on one side and women on the other, or carry both swords, which were symbols of masculinity, and spindles, which were symbols of femininity, and so on and so forth. And in one text, they're described as those whose maleness Ishtar turned female for the awe of the people. And so I think, that sort of t gives you a sense of how Inanna slash Ishtar is associated with transcending gender. And also in that short snippet that I read out earlier, we hear of her turning men into women and women into men. So definitely, again, this is one of those categories that Inanna, as goddess of transformation, can just transgress, and that is part of what makes her so interesting, so fascinating. But I would
Celene,
say
how
that
does that relate
she's
into?
never
Sorry.
depicted herself as male. That is worth noting though.
Celine, how does that relate into the world of thunder? So what does thunder make of gender?
I mean, I think it's a really great question. And again, I think it's one of these questions that we're still asking, like what's happening here? Um, one of the things that I think is really interesting, kind of thinking about gender a little more broadly during this time in the ancient Mediterranean that we think thunder emerged from, is that particularly in terms of like philosophical explorations with things like the Adam and Eve story, for example. And we get these two kind of creation myths in the book of Genesis. And in the first one, the human being before it gets Eve gets split out from Adam's side or rib. Um, the human being is created in the image of God, plural. Says us, let us create human beings in our image, male and female. He created them, and so this gets kind of yoked to Platonic ideas of the androgyne, and so this fancy word that's just man and woman put together in Greek. And one of the things that people notice kind of on a regular basis is that androgynes, of course, they're technically both male and female, but they always get coded as male. There's a way in which female virgins get coded as male because being a male means not being penetrated. And so, what is happening in a text like Thunder, where you have like a primarily female um, personage deity who then is able to kind of dip into this maleness, and what is that about? And so to me that's like there are some just really interesting questions there about what is this saying about the construction of gender in all kinds of ways. And I think, Sophus, when you were talking, one of the other things that just occurs to me that in, you know, third, fourth century in Christianity, we start to get kind of more of these what we call apophatic lists of who God isn't. We can't say who God is, but we can only say who God isn't. And it just makes me wonder about, again, the difference psychologically for the reader hearer when you're gathering in all the ises instead of pushing away all the nots. And there's something very, very, I think, different experientially that's happening between with these texts that are really trying to gather things in rather than apophatically pushing them away and negating.
Oh, that's a really beautiful way of putting it, Celene. I really like that. Yeah, and I think you're so right because there are moments, and not actually only with Inanna. Also, you will get this later with Marduk, who becomes in much later periods a sort of main Babylonian god of something that is kind of like what will become like the negative theology of later periods. You know, this insistence on the unknowability of the divine. But as you say, it is not it's expressed through the sort of like overload, not through the stripping away. Yeah, wow. That's really something to think about. That's really fascinating.
Given all of these parallels that we're talking to between the two texts, and as someone who isn't an expert in either text, it's tempting for me to come to the rapid conclusion that in some way, Thunder Perfect Mind, which was written around 2000 years ago, may have been influenced, may have somehow um, been written within a tradition started by, or certainly written to by Enheduana 2,300 years previously. Um, how likely is that, or in what way is that possible?
Well, so the issue is that Enheduana gets completely sort of cut from the cuneiform canon around year 1500, give or take, you know? And so there's really like remarkably little memory of her after that time. But that doesn't mean that she doesn't live on. She just lives on indirectly through echoes in other texts, you know? And at least in the Old Babylonian period, which is the formative period for Akkadian literature, Sumerian at that point has become a dead language. So like Latin in the Middle Ages is still around, plenty around, but it's just nobody grows up speaking it. You have to learn it in schools. And so that's Sumerian in the Old Babylonian period. And, you know, in the European Middle Ages and, you know, deep up until relatively recent history, you would have figures like Virgil, who are people whose people's like access to Latin in the same way Enheduana is this main, very important figure in the study of Sumerian. But around the same time is when we see Akkadian coming into its own as a literary language, and there are several texts that are very directly inspired by Enheduana. There's one, for example, called Ishtar Louvre, which is not exactly a translation, but definitely written in conversation with her, and it's not the only one. And so the question is not, can there be a direct link between Enheduana and Thunder because they're just, the timelines don't match up, but whether there can be an indirect link. And it's like one of the issues, if we sort of like maybe I can sort of talk about the cuneiform side of it, and then Celine can talk about the other side of it, and then maybe we'll meet in the middle, maybe not. But one of the issues with this is that it seems that the worship of Inanna becomes somewhat of a woman's cult and a bit outside of the scholarly circles. So that doesn't mean that Ishtar stops being important for the scholars. She's still very important, but they start caring more about other gods like Marduk, whom I mentioned earlier. But Ishtar is still very much around, and I think one index of how much she is around is that one of the focal points of the worship of Ishtar was the story of the death of her lover Dumuzi or Tammuz, and that really leaves a huge imprint on the culture. Tammuz is still the name of the month of July in both Arabic and Hebrew, because it was in July that his death was sort of mourned. And in the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, Ezekiel is very upset because everybody is mourning Tammuz when they should be praying to the god, which tells you that it's made its way to Jerusalem and is being seen as a religious rival. And that would have included at least an awareness of who Ishtar is. And we even have a scholar who I've been really interested in lately called Ibn Washhiya, who in the ninth century is talking about the fact that there are still people mourning the death of Tammuz. And that's, centuries after the arrival of Islam and 700 years after the death of cuneiform. So, yes, there is a possibility that there is sort of this awareness of Ishtar, but it's hard to link it to specific texts, and thus it's hard to link it to specific ideas of, let's say, Inanna's paradoxical nature. Because yeah. So that's sort of the cuneiform. That's one side of the tunnel. I don't know how far you can go the other way around, Celine.
Yeah. So, Celine, let's hear the other side of the tunnel. Oh,
Mm.
I was going to say probably not that far, but this just this conversation reminds me of when I was working on my dissertation on these retellings of Eve from Nag Hammadi. One of the things that I was looking at were connections between several folks had noticed some of connections between um, Ovid and the story of Daphne and Apollo from the Metamorphosis and these retellings of Eve. And as I was I was at the very, very end of my dissertation, there was a book that came out called Milton's Ovidian Eve. And it was all about these connections between Milton's Paradise Lost and the way that he used Ovid, the figure of Daphne in Ovid, and connected her with Eve. And so, there are always these questions to me, like, where do we find these intertextual resonances that just, because they're so palpable, sometimes just kind of end up in my very scholarly term for this, in the soup, like like the unconscious soup of what's happening. But like thinking about Inanna, like along these lines, the Queen of Heaven, Ishtar, Astarte, and Nana shows up 5 times in the Hebrew Bible. We think that these are all kind of references to her. And so it does make me, again, like with Inanna and the dying and rising, and people knowing about this and thinking about connections with like Persephone, for example. The way that all of this connects to um, astrology, Venus, there are all of these things in the ancient world where there are these resonances. And it does make me wonder, again, not direct lines, but as Sophus talks about and many other, authorship is never about just an I. And these ideas, I think, have afterlives in oral culture in ways that, just even thinking about um, Sophus, your comment that this ended up being more in women's sphere and not the scholarly spheres that ended up being dominated by men. Well, there's so much that we don't know that was probably because they weren't the things that were recorded for the most part. I noticed that in we're finding still all kinds of things in, for example, the Oxyrhynchus find in Egypt, where there were just, it was an ancient trash heap. And there are so many documents that are there, and there are so few papyrologists that they're still just being um, translated for the first time. And all of a sudden, we're finding evidence of women writing and reading and studying in ways that we just could not have imagined before. And so I think it's enticing to me. Um, there's so little that we can ever know for sure about the ancient world, but having a proliferation of imaginings about possibilities, I think helps us ask better questions. And so, just even in the course of this conversation, thinking about these two texts that are separated by 2,000 years, just in putting them in kind of a synoptic juxtaposition, what does it look like to read them together, opens up a whole bunch of possibilities for different kinds of questions to be asked and different possible insights to emerge.
Yeah, no, that's very beautiful, Celine. And I definitely would second that. And I think maybe actually these trash heaps is a pretty good metaphor, like for what's going on here. Like, it's you talked about the soup, but in the sense it is sort of the things that end up in in the general cultural sense of what it is possible to think, and I think to I really like the metaphor of soup, but to go to a much more scholarly term, now we've come to use the word intertextuality just to mean allusion and reference, but originally the word intertextuality was coined by Julia Kristeva, to express the thing that was between text that gave the text meaning, basically saying that if you had a text in a vacuum, it wouldn't make any sense at all. Texts are only meaningful because they're part of this group of texts. And I think, there is, and we don't have to establish an intertextual relation in the very sort of narrow sense of a reference, like a set of references, but there is a sort of more general sense of, an intertextual sphere that connects these two texts, even if, they are sort of at different ends of it. They flow through the same kind of space, and they have changed that kind of space that they're in,
Well,
Yeah.
well, and just to notice this too, one of the some of the folks kind of looking at Nag Hammadi are also thinking about, it in terms of scribal literacy. And so, we know that one of the ways that people learn is the copying of texts. And what does it do? I mean, and again, you talk about this, which I just find so enticing about thinking about this with Enheduana, like what does it do? Like this physical process of copying these texts and how do they become embodied? And then how does that then seep into the culture in ways that we can't even imagine as well? But just like thinking about these processes that these textual processes that are so far beyond what we think of textual um, in the contemporary world. And again, going back to Kristeva and thinking about intertextuality absolutely points to, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, just in terms of the sort of the way that these texts are made, I think it's worth bearing in mind that the reason that the hymn and the exaltation survive is that they were studied in schools, as I mentioned earlier, and the way that they were studied in schools, we're not 100% sure of this, but it seems to be the case, that they would be memorized and then written down, and then the teacher would come and check them, which means that people, educated readers, educated Babylonians could be expected to know this text by heart, to sort of carry it around in their mind. And I think that's also an interesting way that the texts we have are sort of the splatters that are left over from what is most importantly, perhaps, a process of memorization. And I think that's, the natural habitat of many of these texts, and not just in Enheduana, but many of the texts from the ancient world. Their natural habitat is only in part the clay tablet or the papyrus on which they happen to survive. Their natural habits is just as much in the mouth, or in the ear, or in the hand, or in the mind, and often they live by traveling between these. And I think that's sort of such a key thing to bear in mind about ancient texts, that they're much more nomadic than modern ones.
Bringing us sort of right up to date. That's an ongoing process. I mean, you're both interested in how these ancient texts are sort of used in modern literature or modern performance pieces or in music. And in your book, you have this notion of contributory lineage, Sophus, where like these things are kept alive and added to and changed. And there's it's an ongoing process to continue working with these texts that have emerged out of the desert after hundreds and thousands of years of being silent, so that they're waking up and
Yeah,
coming alive in being brought into the use by creative artists, performers, and so on.
yeah, absolutely. And like the reason that I use that term is that there's been so much discussion because, Enheduana lives in the 23rd century BCE, and most of the manuscripts are from the 18th century BCE, so that's like 500 years. And so, there's been so much discussion. Did she write it? Was it written sometime in the middle? Did she write something that was then edited? What are the revisions and so on and so forth? And I think, if we had better evidence, that might be a meaningful discussion, but as it stands, I think it's a bit of a distraction because either way, this is, and then that's why the term contributory lineage is useful because it is a lineage of people contributing to this text and changing it along the way, as was the role of the priestesses. They were not allowed to have children, and most people expected to be fed when they were dead by their descendants, because there was no food in the underworld, so you were sort of relying on offerings. And so instead, the priestesses would feed the previous priestesses, and so and they would then keep this building that they shared across time. They would keep it renovated and resplendent, and so that was sort of my inspiration in thinking about this. But the term itself, I actually took from a scholar named Ranjit Hoskote, who works on a Kashmiri mystic, also a fascinating figure who has certain overlaps both with Thunder and with Inanna, called Lal Ded or Lalla. And there was a similar discussion there about pinning down authorship versus unpacking revisions. And Ranjit sort of came to the conclusion that like that's a distraction. What is actually important here is this contributory lineage. That's the key. It's our modern obsession with like trying to fit it into authorship versus revision. That's not the essence here. The essence is this contributory lineage. And just as you suggested, David, part of what I love about that is that it can extend then into the present.
And as is that also happening with Thunder, Celene? I think you mentioned some writing sort of earlier on.
Yeah, I mean, I do like I think with Thunder, it's so I think it's so interesting the way in which it's really captured the contemporary imagination. It's so I think a lot of the scholarship on Thunder has been, initially it was kind of going back to something Sophie said a while back about Enheduana, but this kind of proto-feminist, this kind of push in scholarship around, oh, here we have a female deity that may be associated with Christianity, and what might this mean? But the voice of Thunder has really been picked up by so many folks. I'm smiling right now because one of the things that I do in my classes is I have them read Thunder, and then we engage with uh, Ridley Scott and his daughter Jordan Scott put together a Prada ad using Thunder Perfect Mind. And it's this amazing, it's in Berlin and she's wearing Prada clothes. The same actress plays all of these different parts at different ages. And, thinking about just even with
That's perfect. That's wonderful.
and they have such a fun time kind of thinking about like, okay, like these are the ways in which ancient texts are taken up to make contemporary meaning. How do sometimes contemporary meanings really hem things in? Asking questions about like how are ancient texts commodified now? What is it, all of these different things that we um that we do and think about the ancient world, the way we orientalize it and use it for our own means. These texts, I think, become a really amazing place, not only to reflect on the ancient world, but to think about who we are now and to think about both these continuities and disjunctures. I think my students sometimes are shocked by the fact that this is an ancient text because it feels so fresh and modern to them. And they're like, oh my gosh, here is a voice that actually speaks to all of my contradictions. And what does it mean then that we have these texts that both um, are so embedded, of course, in their ancient sensibility and their ancient context. And at the same time, we see this shared humanity that spans across time. Um, no matter how much that's us reading into things and what's actually there. But I think they become really important places for us to reflect. And there's something about, sorry, I feel like my brain is going 10 miles and like probably like 100 miles an hour and my mouth won't go as fast as I want it to go. But these places where, um, the excess and proliferation within the text allows us actually a place to rest and reflect in ways that so many of our contemporary voices don't. And so I think this is why then, from like Toni Morrison to Nurse with Wound, people are picking up Thunder Perfect Mind.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because like, including earlier in this conversation, I was describing the poetic style as one of speed, and it's so interesting to turn it around and think about, well, what is it? What if it is instead a poetic of slowness in a sense? And I think definitely one of the aspects of Enheduana that make her so difficult to translate is the insane compactness. Like, it'll be I'll be translating into English and it'll be like 15 words in English and three in Sumerian, like because there's so much in each of these lines. And I think, she herself compares her poetic speech to honey, which has become like such a cliche in the modern vocabulary. But just if you think about it for a moment, honey is so viscous, honey is very thick, and like as I sometimes say when I'm talking about Enheduana, you wouldn't want to eat a whole bowl of honey. Like that would also be a lot. And that's sometimes what reading the exaltation and the hymn feels like. It feels like eating through honey because it's so, dense, but perhaps specifically because of that denseness, it can actually, within the overwhelm, within the excess, actually slow us down and force us to then think what is actually going on, what kind of world do we live in, if this is a world ruled by Inanna, as the text asserts, if this is a text ruled by Thunder Perfect Mind, then what kind of world do we live in? And I think that would be sort of my concluding remark, that these questions of theology seem to us to be discussions about deities, but I think for the readers at least as much discussions about how the nature of those deities reflect the nature of the world as we experience it.
Well, and I love this. And so
Absolutely.
then I would just in my conclusion with this, just thinking about going back to honey, like it's also sticky, and kind of noticing like what sticks to us in our particular reading and how that changes over time as we change over time, and how we change over time in relationship to engaging with these types of poems, and thinking about that, whether it is like us as scholars kind of going back again and again and again, or thinking about folks copying things out in the ancient world, or people who are kind of in love with the way that these things sound. And I have a friend who's kind of listening to thunder over and over, like trying to find people speaking thunder and listening to it in all kinds of ways again and again and again through like YouTube videos. And so I love this idea of like the viscous wading through, slowing down, but then also this piece of like the stickiness of it, and like where do we feel that like palpable friction and um entrapment, and also like what doesn't stick, in the midst of it too, what sticks in multiple different readings. So yeah, thanks, Sophus.
Thank you, thanks to you, Celene, and thank you not least to David,
Thanks,
without whom I
David.
had never heard
Thank
about
you
Thunder
both.
Perfect Mind. So thank you so much for bringing these texts in conversation with each other. I think it's we've I think we've shown that it's a productive conversation. And just one last point of similarity, I also discovered Enheduana when I was 19. So there you go, and I have been obsessed with her since. Mm.
Thank you both so much. Sophus Helle, Celene Lillie, thank you both enormously. Thank you.
Thanks, David.